紧接着呢，我们要直接来进行第一场大会的主题演讲。Ladies and gentlemen, next we would like to begin our first keynote speech today. 好，那接下来呢，我们今天的第一场大会主题演讲呢，也是特别邀请到了贵宾来为我们进行分享。Ladies and gentlemen, now let's welcome Mr. Shane Huntley, Senior Director of Google's Threat Analysis Group, to give us his presentation. Please welcome Mr. Huntley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Just over 12 months ago, there was the Russia invasion of Ukraine. This was not just a physical war, but also a war that had implications for cyberspace. Today, I'm going to speak through what we've observed, our observations and insights into the cyber conflict and how it interacted. But not just to understand this foreign conflict in its own rights, but also to draw out some conclusions and some ideas about what it means for future conflicts going forward around the world. Because this will not be the only conflict that has a cyber component. So, I lead up Google's Threat Analysis Group, which is only one of the many security teams involved in securing Google. Our mission, which started 13 years ago, is to secure Google and our users worldwide, which really means almost everybody on the planet, from cyber threats. We work closely with our Mandiant colleagues, which is now part of Google Cloud, who have been a recognized leader for many years and undertake cyber threat intelligence and incident response. And also with many other teams across the company to actually fix and resolve these issues, such as Google Trust and Safety, which actually safeguards our products from abuse. Because one thing is that cyber threat intelligence is like, while it's very exciting and interesting and you can talk about all these things, it only really matters if you can do something about it. And over the last 12, 14 months and before, we've been heavily involved in securing users in Ukraine, assisting the Ukraine government, and trying to keep the world safe through our efforts and providing of services and security. We're talking in general here about three main things: how the Ukraine conflict transformed the cyber threat landscape. We'll cover the three main threats that my team looks at. Government-backed attackers. These are government agencies, both military, intelligence, and funded agencies which are undertaking cyber operations. We'll look at information operations, which is the shaping of narratives, and trying to leveraging the full spectrum of attacks to kind of change public opinion via covert means. And I'll also cover cybercrime, which some people don't think of in terms of conflict, but we actually saw significant overlap and some interesting synergies here between what happened in the cybercrime landscape and what was happening in the government world. And I'll go in detail in all three of these. So firstly, let's talk about government-backed attackers. This is the core mission of my team going back the full 13 years. We had a government-backed attack against Google back in 2009, and at that time we formed Threat Analysis Group as a response to actually sort of understand these threat actors to say that it never happened again. Over that time, we've called these actors advanced persistent threat or government-backed attackers or all sorts of different names. But in the end, this is cyber attacks and cyber espionage being done by governments. And what did we see in this war? We saw that the preparations started well before the invasion. So it's not the shooting war starting which actually kicks off the cyber operations. We actually saw that the borders of this war went actually much wider, and the cyber operations were much broader than the borders of the war, and much more targeting in NATO countries. And we also saw waves of destructive malware, which this is the kind of key part which is different to the day-to-day normal espionage. And we also saw this intersection between the normal government-backed attacker hacking and then also the other efforts such as information operations and tying into the destructive world. So this is a pretty kind of tight chart, and I'm not expecting you to read all of this. We actually published earlier this year a comprehensive report called Fog of War, and this goes into quite a level of detail of everything I'm talking about today and what we observed. We actually go into details about the various agencies involved, and some of these agencies come from military intelligence or from the FSB or SVR, and we actually saw differences between them. And we saw some coordination, but we also saw differences. So I think the takeaway here is, one, that countries have multiple actors, but also that their responsibilities get split up. And for some cases, you can see that like some of the countries, like the ones in the middle, really covered only Ukraine and NATO. Others went further afield to my home country of Australia, even to South America and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And then we saw the more kind of military intelligence, which were very broad in their targeting. We also saw some agencies only did espionage, but others actually undertook information operations, and then the actual destructive attacks was even more sort of limited to a number of agencies. And the targeting also varies from agency to agency. So the main takeaway is there's a lot of this. And while it sees as like 6 groups here, my team tracks over 270 different threat actors worldwide. So even these 6 actually only represent a very small amount. And the last thing I note, we'll get back to, is that it wasn't just Russia itself. We actually saw this group that we call Pushka from Belarus actually heavily involved and coordinating in some of this targeting. So as I mentioned, the preparations here started long before the invasion. There's actually a long history here, going back even further than this chart, where over the last decade or so that we've spent tracking Russian operations, that we've actually seen Ukraine has been one of the primary targets. And in many cases, it's actually been called out by others as the test bed for their cyber operations. And what you can see here is we've actually overlaid the sort of operations of the war, such as the massing of troops and the actual invasion, with the cyber activity. So we actually see, similar to the military operation, there's also different phases of the espionage operations, where we actually have phishing campaigns targeting Ukraine at the same time they're building up troops. So the same way they're positioning their tanks, they're also positioning their cyber assets, their implants, and their exploits. And then we actually saw also waves of attacks coming with the actual invasion, but also this like long-running phase afterwards as well. So this is something to think about in terms of all future conflict, is that the actual cyber part of this is starting well before anything actually happens on the ground. But as I said, Russia has been targeting relentlessly Ukraine for many years, including with destructive operations even before the conflict. But even still, when we went back and actually looked at the range of activity, we actually saw there was a 250% increase comparing 2022 to, say, 2020 before the war. And this shows that, even if there is a high level of operational tempo, there is actually also room to escalate. And a lot of this escalation, though, actually comes from the transferring of capability. It's not as if the overall capability of the country increased massively, but they were pushing more and more of this towards Ukraine. And that's something to think in future conflicts, is that a country may not only face the parts of that country, the adversary that normally target them, but can pull in resources from elsewhere. And as you can see, the targeting on the right is many of the same places we'd kind of expect, but also some that maybe you wouldn't expect. So Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs are number 1 and 2, but then it really gets down to places that may not have the same capability to defend themselves, such as city councils or Ministry of Justice or railways and critical infrastructure. And it actually went a lot deeper than this, or many, many targets. So it's not always the top line agencies which are going to be targeted here. It can go a lot deeper. As I mentioned, we also saw that their targeting actually went broader. So while the actual war may be contained primarily to the Ukrainian border, the actual Russian-backed government groups targeting users actually went much broader to NATO as well. We saw them pulling resources of targeting against the rest of the world towards targeting of NATO. And then that led to a 300% increase of NATO country targeting in 2022 compared to 2020. Much of this driven by Frozen Lake, which is APT-28, and Pushka, the Belarusian service, also known as Ghost Rider. So destructive cyber attacks is actually the part that probably everybody thinks more of when they think about cyber war. There's been a lot of predictions for many years that, like, as soon as a shooting war started with a country such as Russia or someone else, we'd see immediate and totally effective destructive attacks going against infrastructure and everywhere else. I'd say that wasn't observed, right? So we didn't actually see, like, this amazing success rate of the entire infrastructure going down from cyber attacks. And some people say it wasn't because of not effort, some it wasn't detection. But in our report, and especially from our Mandiant colleagues who were heavily involved in incident response, they were actually able to sort of like tell a more nuanced story about what was observed and what was tried. So we really saw in the positioning stages, like early on prior conflict, that this was about positioning. And I think what's lost on a lot of people here is, with regards to destructive cyber attacks, is that you don't just turn up and do all your wiping immediately, right? So there's actually still phases. You actually have to gain access to a system in most cases to actually do the attack. You can't actually run the wiper software until you get access to the network. So destructive attacks aren't some magically different thing. They are just a later stage of further attacks. And so prior to the kind of hostilities, there was like a lot of cyber espionage, collecting information, and what looked like pre-positioning. The phase 2 that kicked off in February 2022 is when we saw the attempted deployment of wiper malware. As you can see by the list there was actually a range of different capabilities, and they were throwing a lot of different capabilities from a lot of different angles. I will say the Ukrainian government and others and people working with them did a pretty good job to actually help mitigate and defend against these attacks, which probably significantly decreased their effectiveness. But there certainly were effects there. There certainly was not like a zero effect. Then we see future phases where they sort of coalesce against using one sort of malware. They are doing sustained targeting. Sort of after the initial push, it becomes sort of opportunistic and working towards it. But then later stages actually get more complex. And you actually see, in some ways, Russia gaining a level of understanding here as they realize that they are balancing their operational goals. That they're losing access, they're gaining access, but any attacker actually has to weigh up whether they are going to collect information or whether they're going to do destructive attacks. Because to be honest, as soon as you start throwing out wiper malware, that's a really good way to get caught. It's hard to be very subtle and stealthy when you're throwing out wiper malware. So they're having to do these trade-offs of what's more important, collecting the information or kind of destroying data. And we see them make decisions of those types. We also see them actually balancing up of, they'll regain access to a network they were kicked out of and then immediately try and do the wiping because they know that they can't maintain this level of access because the defenses are getting better there. And so we're seeing this renewed effect. I don't think this goes away, but I think it's moved more into the background noise. But we're also ready for these sort of like surprises. I'd say one thing we didn't observe out of the destructive attacks, though, which many people sort of theorized about, was that there was this theory or worry or concern, which is a legitimate concern, that we'd actually see some of this sort of destructive attacks going outside to NATO or the US, and that was not significantly observed. So information operations. Information operations is trying to shape the information landscape. And Russia has been heavily involved in that. They've involved in targeting US elections in the past. And unsurprisingly, we actually saw them heavily using their information operations capabilities of various forms to target messaging around the world. And this is what we have to expect from any threat actor, is that there is also an information hearts and minds battle to be won as part of this battle, as well as the on-the-ground battle and cyber battle. We saw them using overt and covert mechanisms. We used them such as sort of like state media or renamed state media, but also pretending to be real users. We saw this resurgence of hacktivism, which is kind of information operations, but kind of fascinating, right? So there was like this patriotism on both sides of people wanting to get involved and do something. It's the kind of keyboard warrior, the teenager at home that wants to contribute to the effort in some way. And in many cases, that made the incident response and understanding what was going on more and more complex, because suddenly we're not just tracking the standard state-sponsored actors, we're also having to track every patriotic teenager that downloads some hacking tools that wants to get involved. And something we actually sort of saw for the first time during this conflict was Russian intelligence actually connecting to the hacktivists and actually targeting them. So before this, we really saw the hacking community, the sort of cybercrime community, and the sort of government work were actually relatively separate on a day-to-day basis. And we didn't see these day-to-day links, but we actually saw almost like a surge capability and direction of hacking efforts from amateurs being directed via the government. And this is a similar graph here of what we're talking about in terms of like the different groups. We've got 3 different groups here of targets of information operations actors that we took down on Google platforms. We've got the Internet Research Agency, which is run by Prigozhin, probably the most famous effort here, involved in election targeting in the past. We have a Russian consulting firm, which is really kind of doing PR on behalf of the government. And we're doing other efforts that seem much more directly affiliated with Russian intelligence. And you can also see the list here of like how many things we've taken down over these. But it's all about pushing pro-Russian messaging, pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian messaging. Unsurprising. And in 2022, we actually took down 1950 instances of I/O activity on our platforms. The biggest surge actually happened in March, when Google announced extraordinary measures we indefinitely paused monetization and globally blocked recommendations of Russian state media against our platforms. So this actually really reduced the reach of the Russian government on our platforms via legitimate means, so caused them to actually have to step up their illegitimate means to try and achieve the same reach on our platforms. And then you can actually see like the various numbers here, and again, more details in our report, which actually covered the takedown. And so we are very much watching these actors on a day-to-day basis, linking their activity together, making sure that the debate and discussions on our platforms and with our partners and other platforms is legitimate and isn't being driven by, government threat actors, right? Because that is what we want as society. We believe in free expression. We believe people should be able to discuss the issues of the day, but those issues shouldn't be pretending to be somebody they're not, or large-scale coordinated activity. And we've been significantly disrupting this and continuing to do so on a day-to-day basis. One thing that is surprising to a few people, though, is people kind of imagine that Russia is out there trying to actually convince all of us in Australia or America or Taiwan about the kind of Russia side of the war. Really, though, what we've seen is Russia's primary effort was actually targeting their own domestic population. And I think this is something to watch out for as well in future conflicts, is that a huge part of maintaining support is also maintaining local. And we actually see that like 93% of the conflict was actually Russian or Russian language content, noting that there is sort of like Russian language speakers worldwide. And there's small amounts of other efforts. Cybercrime is something that Russia is kind of famous for, really, right? Like, if you think of ransomware, there's probably a reasonable chance you're thinking of Russia, though, to be honest, there was actually a fair number of Ukrainians involved as well. So there was actually quite an upheaval in the cybercrime space, and there was this group called Conti, which was one of the bigger ransomware operators, and they really fell apart because they basically had both Russian and Ukrainians all working together previously doing cybercrime. And suddenly when one of the nations invades the other one, it wasn't really good for group cohesion. And this group fell apart. They actually leaked a lot of their communications, and we learnt a lot of things, including seeing the messages where they're complaining about all the ways we're disrupting their operations, which makes me happy. But this actually pulled them apart, and we actually saw that some of the groups actually pulled together in a way to be more patriotic. So we saw ex-members of Conti from Russia actually involved in kind of political operations. We saw a rapid evolution in how these operations work, but we did not see ransomware retaliation. So kind of the big fear would have been if we actually saw all the ransomware groups going after the US or allies or NATO allies in a way against critical infrastructure, so shifting from a commercial to a kind of nationalistic model. That's not been observed. So it's not saying it's something we should not watch out from. I will say that the response against ransomware across the industry over the last couple of years has been very good. It is still a threat, but I personally think we are past peak ransomware, but that's a controversial opinion. And we can talk here about some of the former members of these cybercrime groups, about how they were able to kind of target using spam emails, using fake updates and phishing emails, and they're targeting various sort of Ukrainian public and private organizations. So they're sort of using the skills they used to have building up their wealth and money, were being actually targeting the different Ukrainian organizations for purposes. So we did see this repurposing, but primarily limited to Ukraine and some European organizations working directly in Ukraine. So we put this report out a couple of months ago, and it's not slowing down. So we put another update out only a couple of weeks ago, which you can see on our blog, and Ukraine remains Russia's biggest cyber focus. Their operations are evolving, their targeting is becoming more sophisticated, they're learning to do new things, they're building new capabilities, and they're continuing to do serious espionage in support of their military operations. And this stuff matters, right? So if you have Russian military intelligence targeting specifically military and intelligence and the specific organizations involved in the defense of Ukraine, then there's a great information advantage. So we have to realize that anybody involved in an actual conflict on an ongoing basis is also going to be involved in this ongoing cyber conflict, and this cyber conflict will have real and can have real effects. So I've talked a lot about Russia. One of the other things we actually saw is it wasn't just Russia that it was involved. They obviously were the primary actor, but at the same time, we actually saw the world's intelligence agencies focus to Ukraine to understand what was going on. And this is normal, right? So when the COVID pandemic hit, we saw all the world's intelligence agencies trying to collect information on COVID. So when the war started, we actually saw government-backed attackers that we tracked from China actually targeting Ukrainian organizations. And we actually saw the information operations, a group we call Dragon Bridge or Spamouflage Dragon, actually push some of their messaging. And it was very sort of like Russian narrative, sort of like pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine. But this was more along the lines of Dragon Bridge really will push anything which pushes China good, US and the West bad. But we have to think that this is a complex environment, right? So it means that if you're facing a conflict, you don't only have to worry about your current adversaries, you also have maybe having to deal with, like the Ukrainians were, incidents coming from the other side of the world, from a totally different threat actor who is trying to collect intelligence on what's going on. So sort of finishing up, I talked a lot about this specific war, but let's think about the general direction about where all of this is going. And I think you can all draw some conclusions about how this may affect the future for, various future conflicts. What we have seen continually over the last 13 years is a greater number of countries and groups doing these government-backed attacks. We started out tracking a couple of groups. Now we track pretty much a hacking group from almost every country on the planet. Even the smallest nations are now able to buy capabilities off the shelf or send some the university students to some training courses and learn. So this capability in some form is within everybody's reach. We are seeing attacks getting more sophisticated. We have seen and have spoken about the zero-click exploits against iPhones. We're talking about 0 days. My team is so far this year uncovered 8 different 0 days being used, and primarily being delivered by commercial surveillance vendors. And there's also been significant supply chain attacks, such as the SolarWinds attack, which are kind of really new level threats. With all of those new exciting threats, though, we have to remember that when you saw the graphs I showed earlier, a huge amount of the attacks going on a day-to-day basis, supporting directly a military operation, were actually phishing and malware and capabilities that we've been dealing with for years, and we still need to deal with. And this emphasizes that everything we do in IT security, that the basics of having two-factor authentication and zero trust networks and all of the basic security is so critical, because even coming from a major cyber power like Russia, in wartime, most of their attacks are not these sort of magical, mythical 0 days, 0 clicks, and the day-to-day is still very much the things that good IT security and good defenses can take care of. I do think we have to understand that destructive malware is part of modern warfare. Anybody has to think of it's an option that's on the table, it's an option that's available, and it's an option that can be used outside the battlefield more broadly to places they might not get away with stepping out. But we have to realize that it isn't a magic bullet. So I think people sometimes either think that destructive capabilities can't exist, or that any adversary will be able to take down any infrastructure with precision at any time. And I think that is actually a lot harder than people think, and also gets in the way of the intelligence collections and other operations that are being conducted by these operators. And which gets me to my last point, which I think is that the nations use these cyber operations for multiple strategic objectives. We actually see that they're having to balance out, espionage, influence, destruction, and all of these different ways that very similar capabilities can be used. So it may be the same kind of hacking that actually may be pre-positioning to do a wiper attack, or it might be the same sort of attack which is collecting information that could be used in a hack and leak information operations campaign, or it could just be used to provide information back to their forces to allow them to gain a battlefield advantage because they're able to collect information on something like troop movements or diplomatic. So there is actually going to be a range of attacks, and that means that attackers have to marshal their resources in different directions to understand where they're best going to put their limited resources. But that also means that defenders have to take a broader approach about how they defend. They can't just think about defending these 3 obvious things. They have to think more broadly, like an attacker, to think of all the ways and all the places an attacker may target, to think about where we can actually do the defense, because both attackers and defenders will always be resource constrained. So thank you very much for having me here in Taiwan. I'm having a wonderful visit in your wonderful country, and I hope I've managed to provide some insights into what we've observed over the last year and a bit in terms of targeting. The link up there is to our full comprehensive report about these threats, and then also you can look at our blog post and other places where we regularly publish on threats worldwide from different threat actors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Huntley, for the wonderful speech. Thank you.